Let's get down to some of the specifics. I deliberately started with a very, very broad question. So let me jump to the corruption issue. And Pratap in particular has already talked about it quite a lot in his response. So in the sort of publicity surrounding the completion of 2 years, the fact that there has not been major corruption scandals in the center has been given a lot of play in the government publicity. As Meir said, one of the things which has changed in India in the last several years is that corruption has become a salient political issue, which it wasn't 20 years back, right? So one of the reasons perhaps of the UPA's demise is linked to its beating its image on the corruption scandals. We have the emergence of the Aam Aadmi Party pretty much on that plank. So I want your views on in which direction we are moving on the corruption front. Let me highlight a couple of specific points. I think, in my personal view at least, our thinking on corruption is a little too individual-centric sometimes, that you put honest people on top and that will solve the problem. And all of you have written extensively on this issue, and one thing which many of you point out, Pranab in his very well-cited paper and others, is that corruption is often created by systemic flaws, that we have a system which is opaque, which gives a lot of discretion to government officials, and that is a big part of the problem. So unless those things are changed, not much change can happen. The other thing is the credibility of institutions, especially surrounding the judiciary, the law enforcement, police, CBI, and again, Pratap has already sort of touched upon that. So we need systemic changes, more rule-bound and more transparent processes, and we need relevant institutions to be made more credible. So on those two things, which direction are we headed? Pranab.
Okay, let me talk about corruption. My colleagues here have already brought it up, and then you brought it up now. Yes, there have no big scandals like the ones we had in 2010 to 14 at the central level, even though at the state level, to me, like Vyapam in Madhya Pradesh is a big enough scam. In fact, some people have even mysteriously died connected with the Vyapam scam. I don't yet know of the UPA scandals, how many people died. But also, I should remind you that the other good thing is that people will tell you that the coal auctions, for example, are much cleaner and so on. But it doesn't impress me that much because it is not a structural reform. Coal India's monopoly remains. And it's kind of the auction process leaves much to be desired even now. But it is cleaner than before. But let me say that ongoing investigations are going on, even now, on the huge amounts of under-invoicing of imports by several corporate houses, including the Adanis and the Ambanis, on under-invoicing of coal imports, under-invoicing of power plant buying. I think there the Adanis are involved, Tatas are involved, and a few others. Investigations are going on. Alleged allegations have been made. I'm not saying that anything has yet been proved. Similarly, this is for an earlier period, the Krishna Godavari Basin gas reserve, a lot of people are suspecting things. But my related point I would mention is that you cannot talk about corruption going down significantly when the structural reasons for corruption continue. And I would say a major structural reason for corruption in India have to do with election finances. As long as there is no significant reform in election finances, the major structural reason for corruption will continue. In fact, I may remind you that the 2014 national election has been the most expensive election fought in India's history. There are different estimates. The Economist magazine estimated that Mr. Modi's party spent on advertisements, print, and other media, electronic media, and something amounting to $1 billion. Several political scientists have told me, in their rough estimate, it's a severe underestimate. Whatever the estimate, I'm not going about saving any of these estimates. Whatever the estimate, there's no doubt unprecedentedly large amounts in India's electoral history have been spent in the 2014 election. Why am I bringing this out in this context? Do you think the money that's largely probably paid by corporate sector, do you think they're doing it for charity? If not, when is the payback? Has the payback process started? If you ask me, I don't know. But if you ask me to guess, yes, the payback process has started in the form, as usually these paybacks happen, is very quiet relaxation of rules of various kinds. And I've already given you examples of relaxation of environmental rules. Recently, you've also heard about Mr. Adani's ports, Mundra port. The government has already waived 200 crore fines. At least the allegation is the government has waived. The government has just recently denied it, and those who did the allegation have counter-replied, so I don't know where it will end. So Mr. Adani has been waived 200 crore fines for environmental damages in connection with the Mundra port, and so on. There are other forms of environmental regulation relaxations going on, which I would suspect are part of the payback process, done very quietly. You don't hear about that all the time. The third thing that I would mention, there is this reason, historical reason, why you would not see a repetition of what happened in the 2010-14, apart from factors that Mihir mentioned about people, things have changed, people's awareness of the political consequences, etc. But there's also a global change. Remember, part of the corruption was related to the mining mafia. Remember the mining mafia, the Bellary brothers and so on? That was the BJP ministers who were connected with the mining mafia. Now, the mining mafia, even if you wanted to make money, they don't have a scope. International mineral prices have crashed. So there's much less money to be made globally because of China and other reasons. Mining prices there's not much money to be made. So that mining mafia is not operating as much. It's not because we have suddenly become more honest. It is because the the price situation is different. And the last issue that I would mention, we've already both Pratap and Mihir have referred to crony capitalism. I don't think anybody thinks that crony capitalism, which was in the UPA period, has diminished in the current period. Now, crony capitalism is one way of indicating corruption in one way or another, corruption by other means. So if you think crony capitalism has not declined, then you have to believe that some corruption related to it may not have declined. So that is what I would say about corruption. Mainly the structural reasons for corruption, I don't see much of diminution in that. Now, your question about the other question about institution, maybe I should, I've already taken up time. I'll come back to the institution issue. In fact, I wanted to link up with what Pratap, I very much believe in what Pratap mentioned about the institutional pathologies that he mentioned. I have strong opinions on that, mainly supporting what he did, but maybe I should come back to that.
Okay, Pratap.
Look, I agree with a lot of what we say. I'll just make 2 quick points on corruption. You know, corruption it's a complicated debate, different levels, different structures, all of that. I think the 2 points, I think one point which I think is worth talking about, apart from all the things that Pratap said, which is we do seem to be stuck very deeply in a transition dilemma, right? So there was an old rule, old system, whatever its rules were, with a certain amount of discretion built in, a certain amount of protection against prosecution, various other things. And lots of individual actors had adapted to that system, right? Politically, 2004, corruption becomes a salient issue. There's some sense that at least you have to show that you're transitioning to some other system. Now, the transition problem conceptually turns out to be the hardest problem, right? It's the hardest problem because, let's say, banking system, one example, at least partially brought to its knees by corruption. The fear of being seen to be favoring one party or the other makes your ability to cut deals that actually might be good for the economy, which can jumpstart stalled projects, banks sit down, take haircuts, give haircuts to. That ability has actually come down considerably, right? Real estate, one sector in India that is in deep, deep crisis, right? I mean, you can't think of getting the economy growing unless you actually fix that sector, right? Again, you have this dilemma, right? You have these incredible sunk costs with the big companies. You have these half-built projects. Do you salvage them by giving them concessions or not, right? Or do you kind of say, well, that's politically too hard, let's try and jumpstart the real estate industry some other way? I think the honest truth is there is a real institutional dilemma there that we haven't resolved. And we haven't resolved partly because, and again, it's this kind of silver lining of the story, because the kinds of things that you could easily do to resolve them, even if there were no corruption involved, would be very hard to sell politically, right? I mean, every single regulatory concession now, by definition, okay, there must be a corruption story, right? How are you going to clean up these sectors? So to my mind, actually, in the short run, that is, I think, a question that we need to focus on analytically. I mean, apart from the one big elephant in the room, which is the electoral finance thing, and then these individual cases, is there corruption, not individual, corruption? Because we are actually in a climate where any regulatory change is susceptible or hostage to exactly that discourse on corruption, right? And frankly, I think it has actually cut down the government's room for maneuver in ways in which it's not being able to bring us out of that quagmire, right? I don't think cleaning up real estate is going to be easy, right? And this government has not shown any imagination. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the corruption issue aside, I think that problem of a transition regime is something that I don't think we've actually come to terms with. And to my mind, I think that's analytically the more interesting sort of problem, apart from the design of particular institutions. As I'll just stop there.
Okay, so I think 3 short points. I think one is to sort of repeat what Professor Bardhan says. I mean, if people are giving politicians money, they expect things in return. And where do you think that money? If people are spending enormous amounts of money to put, to buy the front page of my newspaper, I'm fairly certain they're getting that money from somewhere, and there's some quid pro quo involved. So that's the basal thing. I mean, we just have to accept that that's the sort of a world we live in. The second point is we're only 2 years in. And I would like to point out that there's a slight category error here. When Professor Bardhan said the corruption scandals of 2010 to 2014, he's actually wrong, because there were no corruption scandals in 2010, 2014.
Sure.
Well, the scandals were then, the corruption was earlier on. Okay? UPA 2 was probably as clean as this government. It was UPA 1 that was the problem. Okay? Up till 2010. So we're 2 years in. I want you to think back to 2006 and try to remember if you knew of any corruption, any big corruption scandal happening in the government. You didn't, but they were all on. Now these things take ages to come out because they're difficult to pin down. You have to let them play out. There are arguments that have been made back and forth. How did they come out under UPA 2? Well, I think you had a bunch of pleasant circumstances. You had bureaucrats who were happy to leak stories about politicians. You had politicians who were happy to leak stories about other politicians. You had some independent forces within the government that were willing to take on corruption within, in other parts of the government. You have to ask yourself whether those circumstances will be repeated under Narendra Modi. It is entirely possible that you can have the corruption that you had in 2005 and 2006 without the anti-corruption period of 2011-2012 if you do not, in fact, have the same circumstances of or transitory circumstances of transparency that we had in those periods. We haven't institutionalized that transparency. All right, we don't even have a Lokpal yet. So where are the future corruption scandals or the current corruption scandals going to emerge from? We'll have to try and intuit them from exactly the process that Pratap is describing. The reason that there is, in fact, a cloud over so many of these regulatory decisions is because there is no external authority or independent authority that can go to these things and declare, this one's okay, this one may not be. In the absence of that, you will continue to have this regulatory sort of inertia. Okay, finally, third point. Corruption changes over time as economies change, as what companies expect change, right? The great corruption scandal of the early 1990s was, about how many votes did Narasimha Rao manage to buy, and there was actually cash involved. I mean, it turned on the question of how much money you could fit into VIP suitcases. All right, that was a very specific economy. What was the corruption economy of the mid-2000s? It depended upon the ability of the state to hand out natural resources. That's a very specific point in an economy's development, where where control of natural resources and the misallocation of it becomes an issue. We may have a different economy now than we had 10 years ago in large part. And now it comes down to what are the minor regulatory changes? Which particular band of spectrum is being opened up to full auction, which is not? All right, in these coal mine auctions that were so delightfully transparent, why were certain mines closed off to steel bidders and left only to power bidders? Why were certain other mines given to steel bidders and not to power bidders? Why were certain mines kept out of the auction altogether, etc., etc., etc.? These are the questions that then you have to begin to ask in a completely different environment. And these are qualitatively tougher questions than dealing with large suitcases of cash or, oh my God, this mine used to be ours, now it's somebody else's. All right? But it doesn't mean that there isn't an equivalent amount of money to be made, and it does not mean that there's not an equivalent amount of discretion being applied. So once again, you have to apply a completely different lens to the morning headlines, all right, in order to figure out where corruption might be happening. And I think we haven't quite got to that mental state yet, which is why we are feeling a little overconfident about it at the moment.
Pranab wanted to add something.
I just forgot to mention something. It's just some numbers which have came out. I think I saw it only last week, but I just wanted to report to you. And these are opinions, not of academics, not of politicians, opinions of business people in India. One, last week, a new report has come out. It's called, for many countries, it's called Global Fraud Report 2015-16. And this is organized by the Economist Intelligence Unit in collaboration with some consultancy group, I forget the name. In that group for India, They had an earlier survey in 2013-14. India, in 2013-14, 69% of companies reported they have been subject to fraud and corruption in 2013-14. That number for 2015-16 is 80%. So at least that group thinks they are more victims of this. Now, it does not mention which sectors. If you ask me, it's probably more in the real estate sector or whatever. Other report that I want to, other survey that I want to report is a survey by NCAR, which also I saw last week. It's an NCAR survey of industries, and they asked business people of what do you think today, and this report came out just a week or two back, which do you think is the major constraint on business today? Number one is corruption. 80% of the companies report corruption to be the major constraint they face. So yes, you don't hear of scandals, but at the ground level, not to speak of common people facing usual bureaucratic corruption, but even the business people. I just wanted to report these two numbers that I saw last week.
Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this issue of corruption, but I had a couple of quick follow-up questions. So if you could take a couple of minutes each to address them. One is, all of you mentioned campaign finance, and that's really the elephant in the room, right? Unless we have a solution to that, there will be, and in some sense, the most harmful form of corruption is not sort of straightforward bribery, but this sort of long-term nexus between big capital and government decision makers. So what is the solution? So if you know, normatively speaking, what should we do? Because public funding of electoral campaigns has been difficult, even in rich countries like the US. And given our sort of shortage of government revenues and such pressing needs like health and education, is there any practical way of, you know, trying to get at this root cause? And the second question, which I wanted to sort of get your views on a little bit very quickly, is that my sense is, you know, some of the corruption which has happened in the last 10 years, especially the UPA period and so on, related to sort of strategy changes. So there was a big push in infrastructure and mining and those sectors. And there was a serious deficit of public funds. So we went in for models like PPP and so on. And we didn't have the institutional structure to handle that very well. And that's where the floodwaters of corruption started coming in. So one way to keep corruption down is to be very risk averse, not to try new models, not to try new approaches, not to put stress on the existing institutions. But is that the way to go? I mean, maybe we should take a little more risk on the corruption front. So,
Yes. Election funds reform is a very complicated issue. There are no easy solutions. I can only refer you to, we don't have time, I can only refer you to some good work that's being done by E. Sridharan, and recently Sridharan and Milan Vaishnav wrote a joint paper suggesting several things on what to do about election finance. One immediate thing, which will be, I can tell you immediately, which will be objected to by all the political parties, is the political parties' funding should be independently audited. At the moment, they have some audits, but like many audits, essentially, you hire your own auditor and the auditor does whatever you want. But independent auditing of party funds, which I can guarantee none of the parties will easily accept. Secondly, even before that, I might tell you that one of the reasons why UPA-2 regime got involved in all these big scandals, their goose was cooked, they themselves cooked their own goose, because they brought an act which is called the Right to Information Act. Right? It is using the Right to Information Act, UPA's goose was cooked. Why is it recently when the Information Commissioner said that the Right to Information Act applies to all public entities, so it should be applied to political parties? Without exception, all political parties said no. We are not subject to Right to Information Act. So forget about big reform. We have an act which says public entities, the political parties, if they are not public entities, I don't know what they are. So bring political parties under the Right to Information Act, and secondly, give them independent, effective auditing. That will be a big step if you can make them agree to it.
Two quick thoughts. So one, of course, there's no silver bullet, and as we know in the evolution of campaign finance across the world, I mean, no one has found a perfect solution, but lots of other things have to change for actually a viable campaign finance system even to be possible, right? So the nexus runs both ways. It's not just that people need money for elections, therefore they'll generate black money. It also runs the other way around, which is you actually have an economic structure which does require cash transactions of various kinds, right? Which in turn will also generate surplus money, which needs to be laundered some way and through political influence. So the question is, look, how much of a grip do we actually have on financial transparency across sectors of the economy? Forget political parties for a minute. And I actually, by the way, do not believe political parties should come under RTI. Right? I should say they should come under auditing, but they should not. I mean, I think it's what the RTI would do to the structure of political parties is a different thing. But can you clean up the real estate sector? Can you use whatever deduplication it is? I mean, you have a broken tax system. You have very few income taxpayers, right? Direct income taxpayers. How can you even talk of transparency at that kind of mega scale when the preconditions across vast sectors of the economy don't exist? So you actually have to, you have to systematically build those building blocks, where you are then in a position to say, look, the first objective of a good campaign finance system is, instead of the emphasis being on capping, which is what we have tried, but it's not going to work, at least shift the paradigm to transparency, But the preconditions for that are simply not in place, right? I mean, if you have an economy that actually runs on cash, it doesn't matter what transparency rules you put in place. What are you actually going to do? So I think you have to begin indirectly at lots of different places for that precondition to exist. The second thing, which is, to my mind, I think on the corruption story, the one I think I'm most interested in, but the big stuff will kind of sort itself out, oddly enough, the infrastructure, this stuff, is what's happening in local elections. So one of the things that is very clear is that at the level of state politics, it's very hard to argue that even that consciousness of we want a clean politics has sunk in. I mean, take West Bengal, take Haryana, take Gujarat, actually, BJP right now, right? Across the board, it's actually very hard to argue that those governments are bending over backwards to project an image, at least, of being corruption-free. But the real surprise in this was the decentralization story. Panchayat elections are now the most, not just the most severely contested, but the most heavily invested in elections. 75 lakhs to a crore per election in some panchayats, right? Why is it that the one mechanism that we thought, right, which is decentralization, having an impact on corruption of a certain kind, why is that mechanism not working? And I think that's the level of government we need to focus on in the corruption story.
So very quickly, I mean, I think this is awfully difficult, but and Pratap is absolutely right. You have to attack many things simultaneously. I'll just give you sort of a slightly optimistic spin on it. All right. What are the reasons that political parties normally give for their inability to have a transparent system? They say we have lots of small donors and we can't possibly keep track of them, right? I would argue that over the past 5 years and in the coming 5 years, our economy will change so much in terms of its ability to track small transfers, even to the degree of 20 to 25 rupees, that will no longer be a tenable argument. So they may find something else. But at any rate, that argument, which has been their primary one for an inability to properly disclose their sources of financing, that, oh, you know, it's like 90% is 20 rupees donations from Eastern UP. You know, that argument will go. So that's one. That's one hopeful thing. The second hopeful thing is election spending is not entirely used just to sort of prop up the Delhi media, right? A lot of it is direct transfers, in fact, to individuals who have a deep distrust in the possibility of their politician ever giving them anything else for 5 years. All right? You expect that this is the point at which you cash in. You get your 1,000 rupees, you get your 1,500 rupees, you get your 2,000 rupees. Okay? Because you may not get that much else from your politician. All right? But at least you got this, cash in hand. Now, if you are an optimist about the way that the welfare system is changing in this country, which to an extent I believe I am, then you have to assume that at some point people will say, okay, you are capable of transferring this money to me in other ways and at other times. All right? It is not just now at election time when I need it in cash. And if that understanding among the electorate changes, the pressure to spend during an election on politicians will go down. And let me assure you, nobody in this country is more pro-election finance reform than the politicians. They don't like having to spend money on elections, and they don't like asking people for money. All right? They desperately want it. So the moment that the preconditions are in place for a better system, you'd be surprised by how swiftly there's a political consensus around it.